Eloise Vance refilled Del Rourke's coffee for the 9,000th time and never once corrected him when he called her the scribbler. She just poured. Steady stream, no spill, the way she'd done it since Eisenhower was in the White House. Del didn't thank her. He never did. And when her little notebook slipped a half-inch across the counter, close to his elbow, he flicked it, just flicked it, with 2 fingers, the way you'd flick a crumb. It landed face down in the ketchup tray, red soaking into the cover. He laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd done all week. Eloise picked it up. She wiped it clean with a napkin, page by page. She said nothing. That was a Tuesday. On Saturday, it got worse. 14 regulars at the counter, elbow to elbow, the whole Saturday crowd. And Del held her notebook up over his head where she couldn't reach it, waved it around. "What you writin', Ellie?" he called out, loud, so the whole room would turn. "The great American novel?" And the whole diner laughed, every last one of them. Eloise reached up, took it back out of his hand, gentle as you please, and slid it into her apron pocket. She didn't blush. She didn't fire back. She just went and topped off the sugar jars. Now hold that picture. Because 3 weeks later, those same 14 people were crowded around that same counter, passing a paperback book hand to hand. The Bell Field, it said on the cover. By E.J. Marrow, the most talked about book in the country that year. 22 weeks on the bestseller list. 3 million copies. And they were arguing, red in the face, about who on God's green earth this mystery author could possibly be. None of them looked at the woman refilling their coffee. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we go on, do me a small kindness. Subscribe so a story like this finds you again. And comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Eloise Vance had poured coffee at the Red Wing Diner out on Route 9 in Chalmers, Ohio, since the spring of 1958. 10 years, come this April. She knew that counter the way you know the back of your own hand. She knew which stool wobbled and which one was welded solid. She knew the crack in the third pane of the front window, the one shaped like a river. She knew the hour the sun came through and lit up the formica so it looked like a sheet of gold. She was good. That's the thing folks never quite said out loud. She was the best waitress that town would ever see, and not one of them knew it. Because the very best ones you don't notice at all. Your cup was never empty. You didn't have to ask. Your eggs came the way you liked them, without you saying a word, because she'd learned it 3 years back and never forgot. She could carry 5 plates up one arm and never let a yolk break. She moved through that diner like water finds the low ground. Quiet, certain, everywhere at once, and nowhere you'd point to. And here's a thing about her that tells you everything. Every one of those regulars would swear they knew Ellie Vance. But not a single one of them knew she took her own coffee black. No cream, no sugar. 10 years, and nobody ever thought to pour her a cup and ask. She came in every morning at 4:45, before Faye, most days, and Faye owned the place. She fired up the grill and started the first pot and set the stools down off the counter where the nightman had stacked them. By the time the truckers rolled in off the highway, hungry and rough and half asleep, the Red Wing was warm and bright, and smelled like bacon and coffee and something sweet in the oven. That was Ellie's doing. All of it, and nobody said so. She remembered things. That was her real gift, if you want to call it that. She remembered that Wes, the night trucker, took his coffee with 3 sugars and liked to sit at the end where he could see the door. She remembered that old Pete Lund had lost his wife the previous fall, and every year on the anniversary she'd slide a slice of peach pie in front of him without a word and walk away before he could see her do it. She remembered every trucker's order and every regular's grief. She held that whole town in her head the way you'd hold a bird in your two hands. Careful, warm, never squeezing. And between the breakfast rush and the lunch rush, when the counter emptied out and the light went flat and yellow through the front glass, Eloise Vance did the one thing that was hers alone. She went to the last booth, the one in the back corner by the pie case, and she sat down with a marbled composition book and a cheap pen. And she wrote. 20 minutes. Every single day. She'd done it for 10 years. The town had a name for it, and the name was fond, mostly Ellie and her scribbling. Harold's dreamer, they'd say. Though nobody knew a Harold, it was just a saying. That waitress out on Route 9, who's always writing in that book of hers. Bless her heart. What do you suppose she puts in there? Grocery lists, probably. Recipes. Maybe letters she never sends. A woman like that, in a town like this, wanting to be a writer, well, it was sweet. It was harmless. It was the kind of thing you smiled about and shook your head and never thought on again. Nobody ever asked to read it. Why would they? It was just Ellie's scribbling. She was a decent woman, too, and the town missed that the same way they missed everything else about her. One morning that winter, the busboy, a skinny kid named Marcus, 16, working his first job, dropped a whole tray coming out of the kitchen. 6 plates, gone, shattered across the floor. Faye kept the cost of breakage out of a boy's pay. That was the rule, everybody's rule back then, and 6 plates would have been half his week. Marcus stood there white as a sheet, looking at the pieces, doing the math on his own face. Eloise never even slowed down. She just crouched, started gathering the big pieces, and quiet, so only he could hear, she said. Tell Faye it was 2. And that night she folded the difference out of her own tip jar and tucked it in the register when nobody was looking. Marcus never knew. Faye never knew. Ellie never mentioned it, not once, not to a living soul. That was the woman. That was Eloise Vance. And the town looked right through her every day of the week. Now here's the part they missed most of all. Here's the part that would have knocked every one of them flat if they'd only stopped to wonder. On the first Monday of every month, Eloise Vance walked down to the Chalmers post office and mailed a thick envelope. Fat thing, stuffed full. She always mailed it herself, never left it with anybody, never let it sit in the diner's outgoing tray. And it went to a post office box in New York City. And in 10 years, not one single soul in that town ever thought to ask her to where, or why, or what a quiet waitress from Chalmers, Ohio, could possibly be sending to New York, thick as a Sunday paper, month after month after month. They didn't ask, because they didn't see. And she liked it that way. She liked it more than she could ever have told you. Because Eloise Vance had a secret, and the secret was the whole point, and the not being seen was the thing that kept it safe. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me get back to Del Rourke, and the notebook, and the ketchup tray. Because that was the beginning of the end of the world as Chalmers knew it. They just didn't feel it yet. Del Rourke ran the counter at the feed store 3 doors down, and he'd appointed himself, somewhere along the years, the funniest man in Chalmers. Nobody had voted him in. He'd just started acting like the job was his. And at towns like that, you let a loud man be loud long enough, and folks forget they never agreed to it. Del's whole life was the diner counter at 8 in the morning. That was his stage. He held court there over coffee and toast, needling and joshing and finding the soft spot in every man who sat down next to him. And Ellie was his favorite target, because Ellie never fought back. That Tuesday, the flicking of the notebook, he'd been building to it for weeks. He'd been eyeing that composition book. It bothered him, though he couldn't have told you why. A woman who kept a thing close, who had something of her own that she wouldn't share, who didn't need his approval or his attention. That was a kind of quiet Del Rourke couldn't stand. So he flicked it into the ketchup. Wanted to see if the ink runs, he said, grinning around at the counter for his laugh. And he got it. Eloise picked the notebook up out of the tray. The cover was smeared red, ugly, and the ketchup had seeped in at the corner and touched the first few pages. And here's what she did. She got a stack of clean napkins, and she sat down right there at the end of the counter, and she opened that book, and she dried it. Page by page, blotting careful, so the ink wouldn't smear worse, so the words underneath would still be there when it was done. Her face didn't change. She didn't hurry, and she didn't dawdle. She just saved every page she could, one at a time, the way you'd tend to burn. Del watched her do it and lost interest, because there's no fun in cruelty when the target won't cry. He went back to his eggs, and that, right there, was the whole trouble with Del Rourke. He never once wondered why a woman would fight that hard, napkin by napkin, to save what he was so sure was nothing. If he'd wondered, if any of them had wondered, the story might have gone different. But nobody wonders about the quiet ones. That's what the quiet ones count on. Then came Saturday. The great American novel. Saturday mornings the Red Wing was packed to the walls, all 14 counter stools full and a line at the door. Del was in rare form, feeling the crowd, playing to the house. And when Ellie set his plate down and turned to go, quick as a snake he reached over and plucked the notebook right out of her apron pocket. Held it up. Waved it over his head. "What you writin', Ellie?" he boomed, and the whole diner turned to look. The great American novel? And the laugh went up. All of them. 14 grown people laughing at a woman for the crime of writing in a book. Some of them were kind people, on any other day. Pete Lund laughed, and Ellie had brought him pie every year for his dead wife. Wes laughed, the night trucker, who she'd fed at 3 a.m. more times than either could count. It wasn't cruelty in most of them, it was just the current of the room, and Del had opened the gate, and the laugh ran through them all like water downhill. That's how it works. That's how a whole town does a thing not one of them would do alone. Eloise reached up. She took the notebook back out of Del's hand. Easy. No snatching, no scene. She slid it back into her apron. And then she picked up the coffee pot and went down the counter refilling cups, and by the time she reached the far end, the whole thing was forgotten. By everyone but her. She didn't cry in the kitchen. She didn't say a word to Faye. She just kept working. But that afternoon, in the empty hour, she went to the last booth, same as always, and she opened the notebook Del had held over his head, and she wrote for her 20 minutes. And I'd give a great deal to know what she wrote that day. Because Del Rourke's face was about to appear in 3 million copies of a book, all across America, and it would not be flattering. And it would not be cruel, either. That was the thing about Eloise Vance that the town would come to understand, far too late. She saw them clear, all their smallness. And she wrote them kind anyway. The third blow came from a stranger, and this one didn't even know she was throwing it. Her name was Corinne Ashby, and she came in on a Thursday with 4 other women behind her. All of them dressed for the city, all of them out from Cleveland on some kind of literary tour of the countryside. Corinne was the president of a book club, and she carried herself like the title meant something out here. She had a way of looking at a room, the Red Wing, with its cracked window and its wobbling stool and its faded gingham curtains. That told you exactly what she thought of it before she said a word. And she was holding a book. The book. The Belfield, by E.J. Marrow, the hardcover, with the little paper band around it that said #1 bestseller. She set it on the counter like an exhibit. Ellie brought them coffee and menus. Corinne didn't look up, never once looked at the woman who poured her cup. "You simply must read it," Corinne was telling her club, loud enough for the whole counter to hear, because a woman like Corinne always plays to the whole room. It's the novel of the year, and no one knows who wrote it. E. J. Marrow, a complete phantom, My theory is that it's someone quite established, hiding behind the name. The prose is far too accomplished for a newcomer. She tapped the cover. You can tell so much about a writer from the page. This one clearly summered in New England. The light in it, the coastal sensibility. And I'd stake my reputation, she paused, and she smiled, that whoever wrote this has certainly never waited tables in some little roadside diner. You simply cannot fake that kind of refinement. Ellie was standing right there, coffee pot in her hand. She leaned in and topped off Corinne's cup, and Corinne slid the cup toward her without a glance, still talking. And Ellie filled it, and stepped back, and the woman never saw her at all. Dell was down the counter, and even Dell thought that was a little rich, a Cleveland woman lecturing his diner about writing. But the funny thing, the thing that would eat at all of them later, was that nobody laughed at Corinne the way they'd laughed at Ellie. Because Corinne had the manner of someone who knows things, and Ellie had the manner of someone who pours coffee. And the town had decided, long ago, which one of those was worth listening to. They were about to find out how wrong they'd bet. But not yet. First it had to get loud. First it had to get as loud as it could possibly get, so that the fall would be a long one. It happened the next Saturday, and it was Corinne's doing. And it was the loudest wrong thing anybody in that diner would ever say. She was back, holding court again, and a bet had started up at the counter. Dell had $10 down that the author was some professor, some egghead, not anybody who'd ever set foot in a place like this. Somebody else said no, it had to be a woman, the way it was written. And to settle it, to prove her point once and for all, Corinne opened the Bell Field to the page she'd marked, and she stood up a little straighter. And she read the most famous passage in the whole book out loud to the counter. You have to understand, everyone in America had read this passage. It got quoted in the reviews. It was the reason people fell in love with the book. It was a description of a diner at 5 in the morning, the grill warming up, the first light coming gray through the front window, the coffee going on, and a woman who ran the place, a widow, kind and tired, and holding the whole town together with her 2 hands. In the book her name was Fern. Corinne read it beautiful, I'll give her that. She read it slow and warm and let every word land, and the whole counter went quiet to listen, because it was that good. And when she got to the part about the light coming through the cracked pane of the window, the pane shaped like a river, the men at the counter started to look around. At their window. At the crack in the 3rd pane, shaped like a river. And a strange feeling came over that room. A prickling. The feeling you get when a dream turns out to be about you. Well, I'll be, said Wes. Quiet. That's near about this place. It's a coincidence, Corinne said quickly, because it did not fit her theory. Every diner in America looks like this. That's the genius of it. A writer of this caliber makes the particular feel universal. But mark my words, whoever wrote this was standing in some elegant reproduction of a place like this. Some clever imitation, not the real thing. The real thing, she gestured around at the Red Wing, at the faded curtains and the pie case and the wobbling stool, the real thing has no poetry in it at all. And she kept reading. The passage went on. The widow Fern, in the book, pours a trucker his coffee, 3 sugars, and knows without asking, and sets a slice of pie in front of a grieving man, and walks away before he can thank her. Now, back in the last booth, in the flat yellow light of the empty hour that had somehow bled into this Saturday, Eloise Vance sat with her marbled notebook closed under her folded hands. And she watched the woman from Cleveland read her own words back to her. And her lips were moving. Not out loud. Barely at all. You'd have had to be looking right at her, and nobody was. Nobody ever was. But her lips were moving, and they were moving a half beat ahead of Corinne's voice. Every word. Before Corinne said it. The description of the light, the crack in the window, the widow's tired hands. Fern pouring the coffee, 3 sugars, knowing without asking. Eloise mouthed every word a heartbeat before it came, the way you'd mouth a prayer you'd said 10,000 times. The way you'd mouth the words to your own child's name. Because she had written them. In that booth. In that notebook. 2 winters ago. And her right hand, resting on the closed cover, was stained with ink along the side, the way a left-handed person's hand would be. Except Eloise was right-handed, and the stain was on the wrong side, and if anyone had ever wondered about that, they might have asked what kind of writing wears the ink into your skin like that. The kind you do for hours. The kind you do for years. The kind that fills a thick envelope, first Monday of every month, mailed to a box in New York. Nobody wondered. Corinne finished the passage, and closed the book, and the counter applauded her reading, and the bet went unsettled, and the great phantom author E.J. Marrow stayed a mystery to the town of Chalmers, Ohio, and the woman who was E.J. Marrow got up from the last booth, and tied her apron a little tighter, and went to see who needed more coffee. That's the picture I want you to hold. The whole town, marveling at a stranger who'd somehow captured a place just exactly like theirs, and the woman who'd captured it standing 3 feet away, pouring their cups, invisible as the air. Now let me show you how close the truth was. Let me show you the trail of little clues that any one of them could have followed, if they'd only looked. Because the clues were everywhere. They always are. Nobody reads them until the end. The first clue was in the book itself, and it was the part everybody skips. The dedication page. You know the one. That page before the story starts, where the author thanks someone. Most people flip right past it. The whole town had flipped right past it. 3 million copies, and how many people ever stop and read the dedication? It said, for F.D., who kept the light on. F.D. Fay Dolan. The widow who owned the Red Wing and kept its lights burning through every lean winter, who'd given a quiet, drifting woman a job and a booth and 10 years of belonging back in the spring of 1958. For F.D., who kept the light on. It was right there, in 3 million copies, and not one person in Chalmers had read past it, because who reads the dedication? And because it never once occurred to any of them that the initials of their own diner's owner might mean a single thing. The second clue was hundreds of miles away, in an office in New York, where a man named Harold Pell was slowly losing his mind. Harold Pell was E.J. Marrow's literary agent, had been for 2 years, and in all that time he had never met his client, never seen her face, never heard her voice on a telephone. Everything came by mail, from a post office box in a town called Chalmers, Ohio, that Pell had never heard of and couldn't find much about. The manuscript had come that way, first Monday of some month 2 years back, a thick envelope, no return address but the box. Beautiful handwriting, a cover letter, spare and plain, and a novel inside it that made the hair stand up on Harold Pell's arms. He'd sold it big. And ever since, he'd been trying to reach the woman who wrote it, and the woman would not be reached. She answered letters, sometimes months late. She'd cash nothing. That was the part that kept Pell up at night. The royalties. The book had earned a fortune, a real fortune, and the checks sat uncashed. E.J. Marrow had never touched a dime of the money the whole country was paying her. The publisher wanted a photo for the new edition, wanted interviews, wanted the author on television, and Harold Pell had 8 months of unanswered letters in a folder and a phantom for a client and a career, writing on a woman he could not find. He had one thing, one thread, a post office box in Chalmers, Ohio, and he was starting to think he was going to have to go there himself. Hold that thought. He's coming. But first, the town's own trouble arrived, and it arrived with a bank's name on it, and it changed everything about what Eloise Vance decided to do. Fay Dolan got the letter on a Monday. Eloise saw it in her face before she saw the paper. Faye came out of the little back office gray and set, holding an envelope like it might bite her. And she sat down heavy on the wobbling stool and didn't get up to greet the lunch crowd. That wasn't like Faye. Faye Dolan had run that counter for 30 years, buried a husband and kept the doors open through it, and she did not sit down when there were customers coming. Eloise waited until the last table cleared out. Then she poured 2 cups of coffee, black, both of them, and she sat down next to her friend. And that was its own small clue, if anybody had been watching. Both cups black. The only person in Chalmers who knew how Ellie took her coffee was Faye Dolan, and the only person Ellie ever sat down and drank a cup with was Faye. They were, the two of them, as close to friends as Ellie let herself get to anybody. How bad, Ellie said. Just that. She was a woman of few words, and she spent them careful. Faye put the letter on the counter and slid it over. It was from a bank in Millvale, the next town up the highway. The Red Wing was behind on the mortgage, behind bad. Further behind than Faye had let on to a living soul, because Faye Dolan would sooner die than ask anybody for help. 30 years she'd carried that place on her own back, and the last few had been thin, real thin, the highway taking traffic off to the new interstate, and she'd let it slide and told no one. And now the bank in Millvale had run out of patience. $4,200. 30 days. Or they took the diner. 4,200, Faye said, and her voice was steady, which was worse than if it had cracked. 30 days. I don't have 400, Ellie. I surely don't have 4,200. She folded her hands around the black coffee. 30 years. And I'm going to be the one who loses it. Eloise Vance looked at her friend, and she looked at the letter, and she looked around the diner she had written into the most famous book in America, the cracked pane shaped like a river, the pie case, the last booth, the gold light on the formica, all of it, the Widow Fern's whole world, sitting there about to be sold out from under the widow it was written for. And something settled in her face, something quiet and final. If you'd been watching, and nobody was, you'd have seen a decision get made. She didn't say a word about it. That wasn't her way. She reached over and put her ink-stained hand over Faye's hand, and she said, 30 days is a lot of days. And then she got up and washed the cups. That week, Eloise Vance took the bus to Millvale. She told Faye she was going to see about a dentist. She'd never told a lie to Faye in 10 years, and telling this one cost her something, you could see it. But she told it anyway. And in Millvale there was a bank, and in that bank, Eloise Vance had an account. Not under her own name. Under another name. A pen name. A name that had earned a fortune the whole country had paid, and that had sat, until this week, entirely untouched. She'd never spent $1 of it. Not one. She didn't want the money. The money was the thing that turned a private craft into a public spectacle. The money was the thread that could unravel the whole quiet life she'd built. And she'd left it lying there uncashed because touching it scared her more than being poor ever had. But she touched it now. She sat down across from a bank officer who did not know her from Eve, and she arranged, quiet and plain, for a bank draft. $4,200. Anonymous, no name on it that anyone in Chalmers would know. Made out to clear, in full, the mortgage on a little diner out on Route 9. And then she took the bus home, and she said not one word to a living soul. Faye Dolan found out 3 days later, when the bank in Millvale called to tell her the debt was settled. Paid in full. By a party who wished to remain anonymous. Faye stood in the little back office with the phone in her hand and could not make sense of the words. Paid in full. Anonymous, she made them say it 3 times. And then she came out into the diner, and she was crying. crying openly in front of the lunch crowd, Faye Dolan, who never sat down when customers were coming, and she couldn't even say what was wrong, except that nothing was wrong. Nothing at all. For the first time in years, nothing was wrong. The story ran through Chalmers like fire. Somebody had paid off the Red Wing. Somebody anonymous, some stranger, some benefactor, some lover of the place. The town made it a wonder. Del Rourke swore it must have been a rich fellow passing through, who'd taken a shine to the pie. Corinne Ashby, when she heard, said it was surely some patron of the arts who'd recognized the diner from the famous novel. Proof, she said, of the book's power to move people. That a stranger would save a diner just for resembling the one in its pages. She had no idea. None of them had any idea. It was the sweetest miracle Chalmers had ever seen, and they built a dozen stories around it, and every one of the stories was wrong. Only one person in that whole diner knew the truth, and she was refilling the coffee. Faye asked her about it, once, quiet, in the empty hour. Faye was no fool, and something in her had started to turn over, some question she couldn't quite shape. "Who do you suppose would do such a thing, Ellie?" she said. "Pay off a diner. For nothing. For a stranger." And Eloise Vance, wiping down the counter, not looking up, said the only thing she would ever say about it. "Somebody must think it's worth keeping." And she went on wiping the counter. And Faye watched her friend's ink-stained hand move the rag in slow circles over the gold formica, and a thought came to her. The first edge of a thought, the way you catch a name on the tip of your tongue. And then the lunch bell over the door rang, and a trucker came in stamping the cold off his boots, and the thought slipped away. It would come back. They always come back, at the end. Because a man had just stepped off a train 2 towns over. A man from New York, with a briefcase. And in that briefcase a folder 8 months thick, and a single thread that led to a post office box in a town called Chalmers, Ohio. Harold Pell had run out of letters to write. He was coming to find E.J. Marrow himself. And he was going to walk through the door of the Red Wing Diner, and he was going to be handed his coffee by the very woman he'd crossed a country to find, and he wasn't going to know it. Not at first. But Harold Pell, unlike everybody else in this story, was a man who read things closely for a living. And he was about to be handed a napkin. And on that napkin, scrawled without a thought, was going to be a breakfast order in a hand he'd know anywhere, the same hand that filled a thick envelope, first Monday of every month. The same hand that wrote the book America was reading. He just hadn't seen it yet. He came in on a Tuesday. Nothing about him fit the room. Gray suit, city shoes, a briefcase held close like it had a heartbeat. The bell over the door rang, and 14 heads did not turn. Because 14 heads never turned for a stranger at the Red Wing. You learned that quick in Chalmers. A new face got one look and then got left alone. Eloise gave him the one look, then she gave him a menu and a cup. "Coffee to start?" she said. "Please." He set the briefcase on the stool beside him, both hands on it. "And whatever's fresh. Eggs are always fresh. Bacon's honest." Then that. She poured. He watched her pour, the way a tired man watches anything that moves, which is to say, not really at all. She was a woman in an apron in a diner off a state route. He had crossed a country to find a genius, and he did not see one, because a genius was supposed to look like something, and this looked like breakfast. That was the thing about Eloise Vance. She had spent 10 years making herself into exactly what nobody looks at. She tore the top sheet off her order pad, wrote it out. 2 eggs, bacon, wheat, black coffee already down, and clipped it to the wheel for the cook, and in the doing of it she set a second scrap on the counter by his elbow. A napkin. She'd scrawled the order twice, the way she always did, once for the wheel and once she'd hand to the customer so a slow eater could check it against his plate. A habit. 10 years old. She never thought about it. Harold Pell thought about it. Not at first. At first he drank his coffee and rubbed his eyes and looked out the window at the gravel lot and the gas sign and the long flat Ohio nothing, and he wondered, not for the first time, if he had lost his mind. 8 months. 8 months of letters to a post office box that answered with silence and manuscripts. His best client. The book of the decade. A name on 3 million spines and not one hand he had ever shaken. He'd asked the motor court clerk. He'd asked the man at the filling station. He'd asked a woman at the Five and Dime who ran the town like a switchboard. Anybody around here literary? Anybody who writes? And every one of them had laughed a little and sent him to the same place. The lady from Cleveland, the book club woman, out at the diner most afternoons, holding court. She's your writer if anybody is. So he'd come to the diner to find Corinne Ashby, and while he waited for her, and for his eggs, he picked up the napkin. Just to have something to do with his hands. He read the order. 2 eggs, bacon, wheat, and he stopped. He knew that hand. He had lived inside that hand for 2 years. The loop on the G, the way the T crossed low and dragged, the letters that leaned like a fence after a hard winter. He had corrected galley proofs written in the margins in exactly that lean, had held pages a printer's boy carried up 3 flights. Pages marked Stet, and no, and she would never say this in a hand that leaned like a fence after a hard winter. He looked at the napkin. He looked up at the woman refilling a trucker's cup down the counter. 3 sugars, she was saying. I know, Wes. I've known for 6 years. Harold Pell set the napkin down very carefully, the way you set down something that might go off. He did not say anything. Not yet. A man who reads for a living learns to be sure before he speaks. He opened the briefcase, just a crack, just enough, and slid out a single galley page he'd carried 1,000 miles for no reason he could have named. A page from the Bell Field, marked in the margin. Fern wouldn't cry here. She'd wipe the counter. He laid the napkin beside it under the lip of the counter where no one could see, and he looked from one to the other, and the fence leaned the same way in both. His eggs came. He didn't touch them. Everything all right? Eloise asked, passing. Fine, he said. His voice came out wrong. It's fine. She was already gone. Now here is what a lesser town would have done, and what Chalmers did instead. All that autumn the town had been playing a game with itself. Corinne Ashby had seen to that. She'd made a parlor sport of the mystery author, and the counter had taken it up like a hand of cards. Who was E.J. Marrow? Who could have written the thing? Somebody read the whole book aloud over 3 weeks of afternoons, chapter by chapter, 14 regulars arguing every paragraph. And the more they read, the surer they got that whoever wrote it had been to Chalmers, had sat in this very room. Because the book had their diner in it, had a widow who ran it, had a trucker with his sugars, and a boy who dropped a plate, and a barfly who talked too loud and was drawn, under all the noise, kind. Del Rourke leaned on that counter the very afternoon Pell sat 2 stools down eating nothing, and Del said it loud, the way Del said everything. I'll tell you who it ain't, Del said. It ain't nobody from around here. You think somebody in Chalmers wrote a book? Get out of town. It's some professor, some fella from back east who drove through once and stole the whole place off us. He slapped a $10 bill on the Formica. $10 says it's a professor. Any takers? Nobody took it. They never took Del's bets. But they laughed, because Del was funny, and because the idea was funny. The idea that anybody they actually knew could have done a thing that mattered. Eloise refilled his coffee. 9,000th time, near enough. She said nothing. She never said anything. And Harold Pell, 2 stools down, watched her fill the cup of the man who'd just bet $10 against her, and watched her not blink, and something in the agent's chest turned all the way over. He understood it then, why the letters stopped, Why the royalties sat uncashed in a bank 2 towns over. Why a woman who'd written the book America was reading came to work every morning and poured coffee for men who bet against her existence. She didn't want to be found. She wanted to be here. And he had come to unfind her in a room full of people who'd never once looked close enough to know. He almost left. He should tell you he almost got up and walked out and let her keep it. He sat there through the lunch rush and into the flat gray afternoon, and he turned it over and over. The client he'd chased for 8 months, 3 feet away, alive and real and refilling cups. He could stand up and pay for eggs he never touched, and walk out to the motor court and write his people in New York and tell them the trail went cold. He could give her the silence she'd built with her own 2 hands. But there was the diner. He'd asked around, the way agents ask around, and he'd heard the other thing the town was chewing on that fall. The miracle. The Red Wing had been 30 days from the bank in Millvale, $4,200 owed, and no way to pay it. And then, out of nowhere, a bank draft had come, anonymous, and cleared the whole thing. And Faye Dolan had stood in her own back office and wept over a gift from a stranger who loved the place. The town called it a miracle. The town loved a miracle. And Harold Pell, who knew where E.J. Marrow's money sat and roughly how much of it, did the arithmetic no one else in Chalmers could do. $4,200. A woman who wouldn't cash a royalty check to save her own roof, cashing exactly enough, exactly once, to save somebody else's. He knew then he couldn't leave. Not because the publisher needed her, because a person who does a thing like that, quietly, and lets a room full of men laugh at her over the coffee she pours them, a person like that ought to be told, once out loud, what she is, even if she never forgave him for it. He waited for closing. The last of them trickled out as the light went. Wes the trucker, back to Route 9. Pete Lund, who Eloise handed a slab of peach pie to on his way out, no charge, the way she did every year on the day, and Pete's eyes went wet, and he didn't ask how she remembered, and she didn't tell him. Corinne Ashby, gathering her Cleveland flock, disappointed to have missed whatever the stranger wanted with her. Marcus the busboy, 16, wiping the last table, first job. Careful now with the plates ever since the night one broke, and the cost of it just quietly disappeared off his check, and he never knew who ate it. And Dell. Dell stayed. Dell always stayed till Faye near swept him out. He was working a toothpick and telling the end of a story to nobody. The neon came on in the window as the sky went dark. Red Wing, in red tube script, buzzing warm against the glass. Faye flipped the sign, but left the pot on. She and Eloise had 30 years of leaving the pot on. Harold Pell stood up. He carried the briefcase to the counter. He set it down. He opened it, and he took out a book. Not the paperback the town had thumbed to rags. A hardcover. The Belfield, the #1 bestseller band, still bright around it. And he set it on the gold formica, and he turned it over, face down, so the back was up, and on the back of the new edition, where there had been nothing before, there was now a photograph. Her face. Miss Vance, Harold Pell said. Gently. He would say her name gently for the rest of his life. E.J. Marrow, your publisher has been trying to reach you for 8 months. The pot stopped pouring. Faye's hand just stopped. Eloise Vance stood very still behind her own counter. The rag was in her hand. She did not look at the book. She looked at the man, and the man looked back with the plainest kind of sorrow. A man who has done a necessary thing he wishes he had not had to do. Del Rourke, at the end of the counter, said, "What?" He laughed, first, because that was Del. Laughing was his reflex, the way flinching is other men's. "What are you? That's Ellie. That's just Ellie." He reached over and grabbed the book, to prove it, to be funny, to end whatever this was. He read the name off the jacket. E. J. Marrow. He said it the way you'd read a road sign. Then he read the photograph. Then he read Eloise. 3 things, one after the other, and the toothpick fell out of Del Rourke's mouth and he did not pick it up. Nobody breathed. The neon buzzed. Somewhere in the kitchen the fryer ticked as it cooled. And in that silence you could hear, if you listened, 10 years of a thing sliding into place. The notebook, the booth, the 20 minutes. The black coffee she poured herself and drank alone. The fat envelope the first Monday of every month. The ink on the wrong side of her right hand. The dedication nobody read past. Faye set the pot down. She came around slow. She picked the book up out of Del's frozen fingers, and she did not turn it to the photograph. She turned it to the front. To the page before the story starts, the page the town had flipped past 3 million times. For FD, who kept the light on. Faye Dolan read her own initials in her friend's book, and her hand came up over her mouth, and she made a sound that was not quite a word. Now, Eloise. Here is what the town had never seen, because the town had never looked. Fear. Plain fear, on the plain, steady face. Everything she had built, every wall of ordinary she had laid up brick by brick for 10 years, coming down all at once in a lit room full of the only people she'd ever wanted to keep from seeing her. She took a step back. Her hand found the apron and closed on it, twisting the cloth. The kitchen door was behind her. Her whole body leaned toward it, toward the dark and the dishes and the not being watched. And Faye Dolan stepped between her friend and the staring room. 60 years old, 4'11" in shoes, 30 years of running this counter, and she put herself square in front of Eloise like a screen door against the weather. "All right," Faye said, to the room. "Quiet. All right. Everybody just... hold on." Harold Pell held on. He gave it a moment. Then he did the only thing he'd come to do, which was tell the truth out loud, because it was time somebody did. 22 weeks, he said. He said it to the room, but he was watching Eloise, watching to see if the truth would steady her or break her. 22 weeks on the bestseller list. 3 million copies. #1 in the country. He set his hand flat on the hardcover on the counter. This book. The one you've all been reading, the one you've been passing up and down this counter all year, arguing about who could have written it. He paused. She wrote it, sitting in that booth. 20 minutes at a time. And the counter did the math on the year it had just lived through. The diner in the book. The widow named Fern who ran it. The trucker and his sugars. The boy and the plate. The barfly, kind under the noise. They had read their own town all autumn and marveled that a stranger got it so right, and there had been no stranger. There had never been a stranger. The woman who'd been refilling their cups the whole time had been writing them down with a tenderness not one of them had thought to give her back. Corinne Ashby was the first to move. Of course she was. Corinne, who had stood at this very counter and lectured the regulars that E.J. Marrow clearly summered in New England, that the author certainly never waited tables. Corinne, who had read the most quoted passage aloud one afternoon to prove no local hand could have made it. While 3 feet away in the last booth a waitress mouthed every word a half-beat ahead. Corinne reached into her big Cleveland handbag and drew out her own copy, the paperback, soft with reading, and she slid it across the formica toward Eloise, and she opened her mouth to speak, and nothing came. She, who always had the word, had no word. She held her book out for a signature, and she could not lift her eyes higher than the counter, and the lecture she'd delivered came back and sat on her like a coat too heavy for the room. Genius, she had said, does not wear an apron. The apron was right in front of her. She looked at the buttons on it and not the face above it, and she waited, book trembling a little in her cultured hand, to be given the one thing she'd told everyone was impossible. Del Rourke had not moved at all. Del, the funniest man in Chalmers, the self-appointed wit of the counter. The man who'd flicked her notebook into the ketchup tray to see if the ink would run and held it over his head on a full Saturday and crowed, "What you writin'? Ellie, the great American novel." While 14 people laughed. Del found the hardcover again, and his big feed store hands turned pages he'd never once read, because he never read the books he mocked. And somebody, it was Wes, come back in from the lot when the cars didn't start leaving, somebody found the page for him. The barfly, the comic one, loud in the diner, generous when it counted. The man who bought a round he couldn't afford the night a stranger's tire blew out on Route 9. Wes read it out, slow, and every soul at the counter knew who it was, because there was only one man in Chalmers it could be, drawn kind under all the bluster, named on the page in all but name. Del listened to himself being loved on a page he'd have bet $10 no local wrote. And his face did a thing his face had never done. It got small. "That one me?" he said. "Just that. Small as a boy." Eloise Vance looked at Del Rourke for a long moment. 10 years she had never once answered him. 10 years of the scribbler, and the notebook in the ketchup, and the laughing. And these were the first words she ever gave him. "The good parts are," she said. Del opened his mouth. To laugh, it was right there. The reflex, the joke, the deflection, the thing that had gotten him through 51 years. And it wouldn't come. The great American novel line came back on him instead, the whole room remembering it at once without a word, and it landed the way a dropped tray lands, all at once, loud. And then a silence louder than the crash. Del Rourke shut his mouth. He put the book down like it was hot. He did not laugh. He would not, in fact, laugh for some while, and when he laughed again, it would be gentler and quieter, and never once at her. And Faye Dolan stood with the dedication page open in her 2 hands, reading for FD, who kept the light on, and you could watch it arrive, in her, the whole of it, in one breath. The book, the dedication, and the other thing, the miracle. The draft from Millvale, $4,200 fallen out of heaven to save her doors. The two facts came together in Faye at the same instant, the way a name comes back after you've quit reaching for it. "Who do you suppose would do such a thing?" she'd asked, in the empty hour, weeks ago. Pay off a diner. For nothing. For a stranger. And Eloise, wiping the counter, not looking up, somebody must think it's worth keeping. Somebody. Faye looked at the somebody. Faye looked at her friend of 30 years, at the ink stain on the wrong side of her right hand, at the plain steady face gone pale under the neon, and she understood that the miracle had worn an apron the whole time. That the stranger who loved this place had been carrying her coffee for a decade, that the money hadn't come from heaven, it had come from the last booth. "Ellie," Faye said, and could not say the rest. "Don't," Eloise said, soft. "Faye, please, don't make it a thing." "It's already a thing," Faye said, and laughed, and cried, both at once, the way you do. "You made it a thing. It's 3 million things, Ellie. It's on the list 22 weeks you." She pressed the dedication to her chest. "You kept my light on. You wrote it right here in the book, and I read past it 3 times, and never once," she shook her head. "FD. I thought it was somebody's initials. I thought it was somebody real." "You are somebody real," Eloise said. That was the whole point. And that broke Faye clean in half, in the good way, and she came around the counter and she did not care about the room, and she put her arms around her friend, and Eloise Vance, who had spent 10 years making herself into a thing nobody looks at, let herself be looked at. Just for a minute. Just by Faye. Then the counter came for her, gentle, one at a time. Because here is what a good town does, when it finds out. It does not gawk, not for long. Pete Lund went out to his truck and came back with his paperback, the one that had gotten him through the winter after his wife, the peach pie winter, and he set it down without a word, and Eloise signed it for Pete, and under it wrote something only he would read, and Pete Lund pressed his hat to his chest. Wes brought his, dog-eared at the trucker's chapter, and asked her to sign it to the road. Marcus, the 16-year-old, first job, came shy with the copy his mother had bought, and Eloise signed it and then said, "Quiet." So only he could hear, "The plate was on me, Marcus, long time ago. Don't tell." And the boy's whole face changed, because he'd wondered for a year who ate that cost, and now he knew, and now he'd carry it. One by one they brought their books, the regulars who'd never once looked close enough to guess. The counter she had written into a book America read, lining up at that same counter to have their own copies signed by the woman they'd never seen. Corinne got her signature. Eloise signed it plain, no dagger in it. Because Eloise Vance did not have a dagger in her, that was the whole thing about Eloise Vance. And Corinne Ashby held her signed book and finally lifted her eyes, and met the author's once and looked away, and that was her whole sentence, served in a single-held look. The woman who assumed genius couldn't wear an apron, waiting in line behind a busboy to be signed by one. Dell came last. He didn't have a copy. He'd never bought one. Why would he? He'd bet $10 against her. He stood there with his empty hands. Harold Pell, watching all of it from the end of the counter like a man who has done a hard thing and found it came out right, slid his own hardcover down to Dell without a word. Dell picked it up. He turned to the page. The one that was him. He read it, all the way through this time, his lips moving a little. A man who mocked books reading one at last. The one with him in it. And when he was done he held it out to her, and he could not manage the words. So Eloise took it, and signed it for him. She wrote something. She turned it back to him. He read it, and his jaw worked, and he put the book inside his coat, against his chest, and he went out into the cold, without his usual line, without any line at all, and the bell rang over the door behind him. And that was Del Rourke leaving the Red Wing a quieter man than he came in. Harold Pell stayed a while longer. He and Eloise sat in the last booth. Her booth. The one with the ketchup and the marbled notebook. And they talked, agent and author, for the first time in 2 years and the first time ever face to face. He told her the publisher wanted her in New York. She said no. He told her about the money, the royalties piling up uncashed in Millvale, more than a waitress sees in 10 lifetimes. She said she knew. She'd used some, once, for something worth keeping. He said he'd figured. He said he'd done the arithmetic in the doorway that afternoon, and it was the reason he couldn't leave her be. She said she wished he had left her be, and then she looked out at Faye wiping down the counter under the warm red neon, at the diner still standing, at the light still on, and she said, "No, I don't. Not really." "There'll be another book," Pell said. "Not a question." "There's always another book," Eloise said. "First Monday of the month. Same box. I'll stop writing you letters. I'd appreciate that." And she almost smiled. The postman was starting to talk. 6 months on, it was spring again, and the Red Wing kept its doors. There was a small brass plate by the register now, no bigger than a playing card, that Faye had made without asking. The diner from the Bell Field. People drove out to see it. Route 9 got a little busier. Corinne's book club came the first Saturday of every month, all the way from Cleveland, and they tipped like they were sorry. Which they were, and they spoke softly at the counter now, and read quietly, and did not lecture anybody about who could and couldn't write a book. Corinne herself came less and less, and then hardly at all. She left her chair at the club empty, and never quite said why. Del Rourke kept a signed copy under the feed store counter in Chalmers, wrapped in a feed sack so it wouldn't get dust on it, and if a stranger came in and got to talking about the famous book from the famous town, Del would go quiet and ring up the man's order, and only sometimes, if he liked the fellow, would he lean in and say, "Lo, I knew her before. And he never once more asked her what she was writing. Eloise Vance still worked the counter 3 mornings a week. She didn't need the money. She had never needed the money. That was the joke the whole town finally got. But she needed the mornings. The bell over the door. Wes and his 3 sugars. Pete and his pie in the fall. Marcus, 17 now, careful with the plates, headed off to college in the autumn on a scholarship a certain someone quietly saw to. She poured her own coffee black and drank it alone in the empty hour, and nobody thought a thing of it. Because now they knew, and knowing had made them kind. And between the breakfast rush and the lunch rush, 20 minutes, every single day, she sat in the last booth with the marbled composition notebook that no longer had to fear the ketchup tray, and she wrote. The town let her write. That was the change. Not that they clapped, not that they gawked, not that they made her a spectacle. The one thing she'd dreaded had come and gone, and, in the end, hadn't come at all. Because a good town, once it understands, gives a quiet woman her quiet back. They just let her be. They let her sit in her booth and fill her pages and mail her fat envelope the first Monday of every month. And they looked after her the plain way she'd been looking after them for 10 years, which is to say without ever making a fuss about it. The morning light came in low across the gold formica and caught the little brass plate and threw a small warm coin of light onto the ceiling. Faye had the pot on. Somewhere a trucker was ordering, and in the last booth Eloise Vance turned to a fresh page in the notebook and smoothed it flat with the side of her ink-stained hand and began, again, to write the town that had finally learned to see her. Writing it, the way she always had, better than it was, and truer than it knew. The quietest person at the counter, it turns out, was the one listening hardest of all. If there's someone like that in your life, someone quietly making something, and nobody's looked close enough to notice, tell me about them below. And tell me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels.